What if I told you that one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, a vast state stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, vanished from the map not once, but 3 separate times? This is the story of Poland, a nation whose rise and fall defied the usual patterns of European history. It wasn't just about kings waging wars or dynasties competing for power. At its heart, Poland was something different, a republic led by nobles, bound together by an unusual system of government that gave extraordinary rights to the few, while often limiting the power of the many. It was also a place remarkable for its religious tolerance at a time when the rest of Europe was tearing itself apart in sectarian conflict. Yet prosperity and influence came at a price. The very freedoms that once made Poland strong eventually left it vulnerable. How could a golden age conceal the roots of decline, and how could such a vast power simply vanish? The beginnings of human life on the lands that would one day make up Poland trace back thousands of years. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence from the Stone Age of groups who settled along the Vistula River, one of the defining arteries of the region. The river offered not just water, but a reliable path for movement and exchange. In a world where land travel was slow and difficult, rivers acted like highways, and the Vistula allowed early people to transport goods, ideas, and traditions. The river's fertile banks also supported hunting and farming communities that grew steadily in size, leaving behind tools and pottery that show gradual advances in technology. By the late Bronze Age, one culture in particular began to leave a clear imprint. The Lusatian culture, which thrived between roughly 1300 and 500 BCE, created fortified settlements that reveal a surprising level of organization. These were not isolated huts scattered across fields, but carefully designed enclosures. Defensive earthworks surrounded tightly built houses, some placed on platforms to withstand flooding. Cemeteries from this era also display a distinct ritual practice. Bodies were cremated, and ashes placed in urns arranged in marked burial grounds. Some of these cemeteries stretched across large areas, with hundreds of graves reflecting a society that maintained continuity over many generations. Fragments of bronze jewelry, weapons, and tools recovered from these sites help historians imagine what daily life must have looked like, with craftsmanship forming a vital part of their economy. One remarkable location from these early centuries is Biskupin, often described as a window into the prehistoric world of Poland. This fortified village, dated to around 700 BCE, was built on a marshy peninsula and surrounded by a wooden palisade. Its streets were laid out in rows with longhouses constructed of timber, each home capable of housing large family groups. What makes Biskupin so striking is how well it has survived. Excavations carried out in the 20th century revealed intact beams and structural details due to the preservation provided by the waterlogged soil. This has led some to call it Poland's Pompeii, not because it was destroyed by disaster, but because it froze a way of life in time. Through Biskupin, historians gain a glimpse not only of construction methods, but also of how communities defended themselves and organized their space. As centuries passed, the land remained connected to distant peoples. Migratory waves moved through the region, with Celtic and Germanic groups shaping the material culture. The arrival of new tools, weapon designs, and styles of ornamentation all pointed to contact across borders. By the early medieval period, Slavic tribes dominated the territory. They built wooden strongholds and small fortified villages known as grody, often located near rivers, forests, or hilltops for natural protection. Their religious practices revolved around cycles of nature, with rituals tied to fertility, harvests, and the movement of the sun. Idols carved from wood stood in sacred groves, where seasonal ceremonies reinforced communal bonds. These early beliefs, while rooted in the natural world, would eventually be challenged by the spread of Christianity. The land's central position in Europe made it a true crossroads. Ideas and goods from the north, south, east, and west converged here, creating a mosaic of influences, but also exposing it to frequent raids. Viking expeditions moved along rivers, while Germanic populations pressed from the west. This meeting point of cultures helped establish the foundation of a shared identity that was far from uniform, but held common threads of language, ritual, and connection to the land. Out of these layers of settlement and tradition, the foundations of Poland's later statehood would gradually form. In the year 966, a political decision was made that permanently changed the direction of the lands along the Vistula. At its center stood Duke Mieszko I, leader of the Polans tribe, one of the strongest among the many Slavic groups in the region. At that time, Europe's borders were constantly shifting, and those who remained outside the Christian fold risked not only isolation, but also military aggression justified under the banner of conversion. For Mieszko, embracing Christianity was not only a matter of faith, but also of strategy. His marriage to Dubrawa, a Bohemian princess raised in a Christian court, brought with it the opportunity to anchor his realm within the fabric of the Latin Christian world. By adopting the religion of his wife, he would no longer be a pagan duke on Europe's margins, but a recognized Christian ruler, entitled to alliances and treaties on equal footing. This moment, remembered as the baptism of Poland, is considered the founding act of the Polish state. Before 966, the Polans and their neighboring tribes existed as fragmented communities with shifting loyalties and competing beliefs. The baptism created a common religious structure that extended beyond tribal boundaries, offering a level of cohesion essential for centralized rule. Christianity was not only a faith, but also a system of literacy, administration, and international legitimacy. With baptism, Latin became the language of record, opening the gates to written law, chronicles, and the ability to communicate with rulers and clerics from across Europe. The immediate political benefits were clear. As a Christian ruler, Mieszko gained the recognition of the Holy Roman Empire, which bordered his realm to the west. While earlier emperors might have considered him a target for forced conversion, his new status provided a protective layer. Instead of being viewed as land to conquer, his duchy was now a neighbor to engage diplomatically. This shift gave Poland breathing room in a time when military campaigns frequently swept across Central Europe. On a domestic level, the church became a tool for unification. Missionaries and bishops worked to replace the diverse pagan rituals that tied Slavic tribes to local deities and seasonal cycles. Temples and wooden idols gave way slowly to chapels and parish structures. The support of the church helped Mieszko establish authority not only through force, but also through spiritual legitimacy. By controlling bishops and aligning with clerical hierarchies, the ruler tied his dynasty to something larger than tribal loyalty, the universal institution of Christianity. Yet contrary to what many imagine, this pivotal baptism did not unfold inside a towering cathedral filled with golden light. Evidence suggests it likely took place in a much humbler setting, perhaps at Poznan or Gniezno, in a simple wooden church hastily constructed for the rite. The event's modest setting contrasts sharply with its lasting importance. It was not the grandeur of the venue that mattered, but the recognition gained across Europe that a new Christian state had entered the stage. From that year forward, Poland was no longer a collection of tribes loosely bound by kinship. It was positioned as a legitimate participant in European political life. This single ceremony, involving water, words, and ritual, became the stepping stone for the dynasties that followed and the framework upon which Poland's medieval identity would grow. The story of Poland's first ruling family begins with the Piast Dynasty, a line of rulers who shaped the foundations of the state from the 10th to the 14th century. Mieszko I, who brought Christianity to his realm in 966, marked the starting point, but it was his son, Boleslav I the Brave, who secured the first royal crown in 1025. His coronation symbolized more than personal ambition. It formally placed Poland among the recognized kingdoms of Europe. Boleslav expanded his father's influence through military campaigns, gaining territory along Poland's borders while securing alliances through diplomacy. His reign displayed both the dangers and opportunities of a land surrounded by powerful neighbors. Throughout the dynasty's existence, Poland remained in constant tension with larger states. To the west loomed the Holy Roman Empire, eager to assert dominance over its smaller neighbors. To the south were the Bohemian lands, linked by family ties but also embroiled in rivalry. To the east lay the Rus, whose princes alternated between allies and enemies. The Piast rulers were forced to navigate these shifting dynamics, often through a mix of war, strategic marriages, and temporary truces. For early Poland, survival often required balancing these pressures without collapsing under invasion. Despite external threats, success also came from internal consolidation. Boleslav I created strongholds and fortified towns that later became the backbone of political and economic administration. New trade routes linked Polish towns to both the Baltic Sea and southern Europe, integrating Poland into medieval commerce. Goods such as salt, amber, and furs traveled in both directions, while merchants brought coins and commodities from distant regions. The introduction of coinage under the Piast further encouraged exchange, creating economies tied less to barter and more to written contracts and markets. Over time, Poland's identity as a crossroads of Europe began to take a clearer form. One of the most striking episodes in Boleslav's reign occurred during a campaign in 1018 against Kiev. His forces triumphed, and the victory became legendary not only for the dominance it displayed, but also for the sheer symbolism of its trophy. Among the spoils carried back to Poland was the so-called Golden Gate of Kiev, a symbolic capture that underscored his ambition to be seen as an equal among the most powerful rulers of the age. Gestures like this were not simply about wealth. They were statements of legitimacy and strength meant to echo across courts from Constantinople to Rome. Yet the line of succession after Boleslav gradually exposed weaknesses. A practice of dividing lands among heirs fractured the once unified kingdom. By the 12th century, what had been a cohesive monarchy devolved into numerous smaller duchies ruled by different branches of the Piast family. Each duke sought to defend his position, often engaging in feuds with rivals instead of cooperating against foreign threats. The result was fragmentation that left Poland weaker and more vulnerable to outside forces. While other European states centralized their monarchies, Poland was sliding in the opposite direction, splintering its authority. Still, the period was not defined only by struggle. Towns expanded, new markets grew, and monasteries spread learning and culture across the land. Connections to both Western Christendom and the Eastern Slavic world widened the range of cultural influences. Over the centuries, the Piast laid groundwork for an enduring sense of identity, even as political division slowed progress. Their legacy was uneven, moments of triumph interwoven with periods of decline, but the dynasty built the framework that allowed later rulers to imagine a future kingdom greater than its scattered tribes. In the mid-11th century, Kraków stepped into the spotlight as Poland's center of authority. The shift occurred after 1038, when the royal court relocated from Gniezno to Kraków, reshaping the city's role in the kingdom. What had been an important regional town transformed into the main residence of rulers who needed both a defensible stronghold and a visible seat of power. From this point forward, Kraków became closely tied to the development of the monarchy itself. Its symbolic importance grew so secure that long after other cities gained prominence, the tradition of crowning kings in Krakow's cathedral carried forward as a reminder of its historic status. At the heart of this transformation stood Wawel Hill, a limestone outcrop that dominated the surrounding landscape. On its slopes and summit, rulers built their residences, chapels, and eventually the Grand Cathedral. Wawel Cathedral, in particular, became more than a place of worship. It was where monarchs were crowned and often where they were buried. This gave the site a dual role as a functional center of rule and a sacred resting place of dynasties. Wawel Hill's stone defenses also reflected practical needs. In an age when raids and invasions remained constant threats, its fortified walls offered protection not only for nobles, but for the emerging administrative offices that ran the kingdom. Krakow's position also transformed it into a commercial hub. Situated along major trade routes, the city linked Western Europe with the distant markets of the East. Merchants carrying salt, textiles, and metalwork passed through its streets, while exotic goods such as spices, furs, and luxury cloths broadened the local market. The profit from these exchanges enriched both the crown and the citizenry, allowing investment in churches, workshops, and civic infrastructure. This economic foundation steadily raised Krakow's prestige above other competitor cities within the realm. By the 13th century, it was clear that this was not just a political center, but also an economic crossroads of Central Europe. A decisive moment in the city's urban growth came in 1257, when Kraków was granted Magdeburg rights. This medieval legal system gave towns a measure of self-governance, particularly in regulating markets, judging disputes, and controlling guilds. With these privileges, merchants and craftsmen enjoyed clear protections, while the city itself gained the ability to regulate its public life more effectively. The introduction of Magdeburg rights set the stage for carefully planned expansion, with streets arranged in a grid pattern and a central square laid out for trade and communal activity. The market square created during this reorganization remains one of the largest of its kind in Europe, reflecting how ambitious that step truly was. By the 14th century, Krakow's growth reached a new cultural milestone. King Casimir III, later remembered as the Great, established the University of Kraków in 1364. This was one of Europe's oldest universities, designed initially to serve as a center for law, administration, and medicine. Its purpose went beyond education alone. By attracting scholars from across the continent, the university positioned Kraków as a participant in the wider intellectual currents of medieval Europe. It introduced networks of learning, strengthened governance by training clerics and officials, and created a space where ideas flowed alongside trade goods. Legends also became part of the city's story. The tale of Krakus, the mythical founder, who is said to have slain the Wawel dragon, gave the city a heroic origin rooted in folklore. Today, that legacy endures in the form of a dragon statue near Wawel Castle, which periodically breathes fire to remind visitors of a myth carried through centuries. Though symbolic, the story mirrors how Kraków rose, from struggles against threats to a position of lasting prominence. The rise of the Jagiellonian Dynasty began in 1386 with a marriage that reshaped Central and Eastern Europe. Queen Jadwiga of Poland, young but already a pivotal figure in European politics, married Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. Through this union, Jogaila converted to Christianity and took the name Władysław II Jagiełło, becoming King of Poland. Their dynastic partnership bound two powerful realms into one of the largest states on the continent. From the shores of the Baltic Sea to the steppe regions near the Black Sea, the territory stretched across an immense area, diverse in languages, traditions, and cultures. This combined strength gave the new state both resources and strategic depth that few others in Europe could match. From the start, the Union had more than symbolic value. Poland, with its fertile river valleys, and Lithuania, with its vast forested lands reaching deep into the east, complemented each other economically and militarily. Together, they formed a bulwark against encroaching powers such as the Teutonic Knights, who for decades had carved out territory in the Baltic through force. Victories such as the famous Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where combined Polish and Lithuanian forces dealt a crushing blow to the Teutonic Order, confirmed the effectiveness of the partnership. Such campaigns secured trade routes and safeguarded agricultural lands that would fuel economic prosperity in the decades that followed. That prosperity centered above all on grain. Poland's plains produced immense quantities of wheat and rye, which were transported down the Vistula River and exported through the port of Gdansk. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Gdansk had become one of the busiest ports in Northern Europe, its wealth built almost entirely on the grain trade. This export economy linked Poland and Lithuania to cities in Western Europe that depended on shipments of bread. In turn, the wealth from this trade supported noble estates, urban development, and the growing influence of the royal court. The Jagiellonian era was not only about economics and politics, it was also an age of culture. As the Renaissance spread north from Italy, Poland became one of its centers. Kings and queens of the Jagiellonian dynasty patronized architecture, painting, and literature, shaping cities like Kraków with new buildings and public works. At Wawel Castle, Italian architects left behind masterpieces of Renaissance design still admired today. The University of Kraków, founded in the previous century, expanded its influence, attracting scholars from across Europe. Its graduates carried ideas of law, medicine, and astronomy into fields ranging from governance to science. One of the most notable of these figures was Nicholas Copernicus. Educated in Kraków before pursuing further studies in Italy, he developed a revolutionary theory that placed the sun at the center of the cosmos rather than the Earth. His work challenged centuries of accepted thought and reshaped the very framework through which people understood the universe. That such a figure emerged from this kingdom reflected the intellectual energy of the time, when questions about faith, science, and philosophy were as vital as battles or dynastic marriages. The dynasty's careful balancing of diplomacy also contributed to its longevity. Through arranged marriages, treaties, and alliances, the Jagiellonians secured influence not only over Poland and Lithuania, but also across neighboring territories, including Hungary and Bohemia. For nearly 2 centuries, their union maintained a degree of stability unusual for such a vast and diverse state. It was a period remembered as Poland's Golden Age, when prosperity, cultural life, and political significance reached heights that connected the kingdom to both Western Europe and the shifting worlds of the East. By the 16th century, Poland had developed a political experiment unlike anything else in Europe. Instead of concentrating power in the hands of a monarch or a small council of magnates, the kingdom adopted a system commonly called as the Nobles' Commonwealth, or Rzeczpospolita Szlachecka in its own language. This meant that the state revolved around the authority of the nobility, the Szlachta, who made up about 10% of the population. That number may sound small, but compared to other European societies where nobles sometimes formed less than 1%, this was a much broader class with access to extraordinary privileges. For them, status was not only about wealth, but also about rights explicitly protected by law. The most important feature of this system was the role of the Sejm, or parliament. Rather than ruling unchecked, the king's authority was heavily circumscribed. Laws, taxation, and most forms of governance required the approval of the same, where representatives of the nobility gathered to debate and decide policy. Sessions often stretched out for weeks, with arguments over local and royal interests dominating the agenda. This ensured that monarchs could not act alone in declaring war, raising taxes, or introducing reforms. While other European kings of the era moved towards centralization, Poland's rulers had to negotiate constantly with their powerful noble estates. At the heart of this arrangement lay the principle known as Golden Liberty. This body of rights had fewer parallels elsewhere on the continent. It gave nobles the ability to practice the religion of their choice, to vote in assemblies, to control who would sit on the throne, and even, in extreme circumstances, to organize a legal rebellion if they believed their liberties under threat. The concept was rooted in the desire to prevent tyranny at any cost. While many states talked about balance between monarch and estates, Poland embedded it as a legal reality. This created a sense of equality among nobles, for whether rich or modest in wealth, each of them technically had a voice that could not easily be overridden. One of the most striking features of this system appeared whenever a king died. Instead of simply accepting succession by bloodline, the Szlachta exercised their right to hold a royal election, open to every member of the noble class. Candidates from across Europe might be invited, offering the Commonwealth the chance to negotiate terms before granting the crown. This ensured that kingship remained conditional and tied to agreements with the nobility. It also made Poland one of the earliest examples of an elective monarchy where input extended beyond a narrow elite. For nobles, this was the ultimate safeguard that royal power would never harden into unchecked control. However, alongside its unusual freedoms, the Commonwealth carried structural weaknesses. Because the nobility enjoyed relative equality and strong political independence, rulers often struggled to enforce unity. Local disputes could stall national decisions, and foreign powers occasionally found ways to exploit divisions by bribing or influencing nobles. The same mechanisms that protected liberty also made collective action slow and vulnerable to breakdowns. This fragility would shape Poland's trajectory in the centuries to come, showing how a system designed to protect freedom could invite instability when external pressures grew too strong. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Poland stood apart in Europe for its unusual approach to religion. At a time when other kingdoms and principalities were fractured by the Reformation and bloodied by conflict between Catholic and Protestant forces, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth put forward a principle that set it on a different course. Rather than suppressing new faiths or enforcing uniformity, the state structured itself around tolerance. As early as the mid-1500s, Lutheranism, Calvinism, and smaller Protestant sects were openly practiced alongside Catholicism. In the eastern reaches, Orthodox Christianity remained strong among Ruthenian communities, while in many towns, Jewish congregations flourished with schools, printing presses, and local self-government. Even Muslim Tatars, who had settled generations earlier, continued to maintain mosques and traditions under the same legal protections. A defining moment of this openness came in 1573 with the Warsaw Confederation. Signed by nobles following the extinction of the Jagiellonian Dynasty, it was meant to safeguard unity during a period of uncertainty. By guaranteeing freedom of worship to all confessions, it solidified a policy that had already existed in practice, but placed it in writing. This was a rare commitment in an age when neighboring powers often demanded religious conformity as a condition of loyalty. In France, the wars of religion during the same period tore apart communities. In the German lands, the principle of cuius regio, eius religio gave rulers authority to dictate faith, producing recurring instability. the Confederation gave Poland a contrast, making religious diversity a legal right rather than a weakness. The presence of so many groups created remarkable urban diversity. Italian merchants brought artistic influences to Kraków and other cities. Armenian settlers arrived with trading networks that stretched into the Black Sea region, establishing their own quarters where churches of distinct architecture still stand today. Germans introduced craft traditions, guild regulations, and urban institutions linked to Western Europe. Tatars, invited by earlier rulers for military service, maintained a distinct cultural heritage that coexisted with their Christian neighbors. These settlers did not erase Polish character. Instead, they made its cities more cosmopolitan and intertwined with international commerce. Jewish communities especially found a new center in Poland. With expulsions and persecutions common in Western Europe, Jewish migrants sought safer ground in the Commonwealth. Town charters granted them rights to settle, run businesses, and administer community affairs through councils known as kahals. Yeshivas and printing presses established in cities like Kraków, Lublin, and Lvov spread learning that shaped Jewish culture for centuries. By the 1600s, their population had grown so large that Poland became the global heart of Jewish life. The phrase, "the paradise of the Jews," emerged to describe this relative security and opportunity, making the region unique compared to the restrictions faced further west. Of course, tolerance did not erase conflict entirely. Tensions between confessional groups sometimes flared, particularly when political or economic pressure mounted. The Catholic Counter-Reformation reinforced the position of the Church in many areas, and disputes over property, preaching rights, and civic influence did arise. Yet, Poland avoided descending into the type of prolonged sectarian wars that shattered states elsewhere. Diversity, instead of driving fragmentation, formed a central feature of the Commonwealth's identity. It provided stability for a vast and varied realm where communities across faiths could function under a shared political framework. How could a kingdom known for triumphs on the battlefield see its strength wither away after those very victories? In the 1600s, Poland found itself locked in near-constant struggle with some of Europe's fiercest powers, Sweden to the north, Russia to the east, and the Ottoman Empire pressing from the south. On paper, many of these conflicts produced brilliant victories, the kind of campaigns that displayed unmatched skill and courage. Yet the same wars that bolstered Poland's reputation left behind a weakened economy, depopulated countryside, and political divisions that gnawed at the Commonwealth from within. The wars with Sweden revealed this contradiction most clearly. During clashes in what became known as the Deluge, Swedish forces poured into Polish territory, capturing cities and looting wealth. The resistance eventually drove them out, but at immense cost. Poland's towns burned, trade routes collapsed, and villages that had sustained the kingdom's prosperity were reduced to rubble. The effort to repel Sweden succeeded militarily, yet the kingdom's resources bled away in the process. Recovery proved slow because no central mechanism existed to rebuild what had been destroyed. To the east, Poland faced Russia in conflicts that stretched for decades. What had begun with campaigns to secure border regions turned into prolonged engagements drawing manpower and treasure far beyond the king's means. Victories brought temporary gains but rarely permanent security. The vastness of Russian territory and its endless supply of men meant that every triumph demanded new commitments of soldiers and funding the Commonwealth could scarcely provide. For the nobility who controlled private armies, these campaigns were demonstrations of loyalty and honor, yet their resources came at the expense of local communities forced to house troops or pay taxes. The Southern Front presented yet another arena of conflict. this time with the Ottoman Empire. Campaigns along the frontier led to dramatic moments when Polish forces stood as defenders of Christian Europe. The most famous example was the clash at Vienna in 1683, where Polish hussars under King John III Sobieski charged into battle, turning the tide against Ottoman forces. The image of armored horsemen with wings sweeping down a hillside became etched in European memory as a symbol of bravery and victory. Yet behind the glory, the campaign demanded immense effort. Mobilizing tens of thousands of soldiers drained the treasury, while families across Poland felt the loss of fathers and sons taken to war. The paradox of the century was clear. Victory was possible, even frequent, but each came at a crippling cost. The Commonwealth's unique political order made it difficult for the crown to sustain long campaigns. The king relied on nobles for both finance and manpower, and their willingness to cooperate shifted with personal interests. Without centralized control of resources, mobilization for every war became a patchwork of private commitments. This carried the seeds of exhaustion, with peasants overburdened, towns ruined, and the nobility wary of ever greater demands from the monarchy. Could the Commonwealth recover from victories that drained it more than defeats? Again and again, the triumph of the hussars, the expulsion of invaders, and the defense of borders bought honor and prestige abroad, but left deep scars at home. What should have been wars of glory ended up as wars of attrition, eroding the state from within. By the turn of the 18th century, Poland faced the reality that constant external conflict had hollowed out its strength, clearing the path for decline in the century that followed. By the late 17th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, once dominant in Central and Eastern Europe, began to unravel. Decades of unrelenting warfare had drained its treasury and exhausted its people, leaving behind a weakened state unable to maintain the strength of earlier centuries. While its borders still stretched from the Baltic to the fringes of the Black Sea, the political structure inside those borders no longer matched the scale of its territory. What had begun as a noble experiment in shared governance was now faltering under the strain of dysfunction and foreign interference. At the center of the problem was the liberum veto, a rule embedded in the parliamentary system. In principle, it embodied the ideal of equality among nobles. If even one representative opposed a measure, it could not pass. The system gave enormous weight to the rights of the individual, but in practice, it paralyzed government. A single objection was enough to dissolve an entire parliamentary session. This meant that passing reforms, imposing taxes, or organizing defense required near unanimity, an almost impossible standard in such a vast state. Worse still, foreign powers quickly realized they could exploit this vulnerability. By bribing or influencing a small number of nobles, Russia, Prussia, or Austria could stall critical decisions and keep Poland politically impotent. The weakening of central authority coincided with the rise of magnate families who amassed wealth and power far outstripping the monarchy. These aristocrats maintained private armies and often governed their lands like miniature states. In many cases, their loyalty leaned more toward expanding their personal influence than protecting the unity of the Commonwealth. With the king's power increasingly reduced, the throne itself lost much of its former authority. Kings were elected by the nobles, but often had to swear to strict conditions before assuming the crown. The result was a monarchy with prestige in name, but very little ability to act independently. The hollowing out of the monarchy gradually turned the Commonwealth into a patchwork of competing interests. Instead of a cohesive state, Poland seemed to outsiders like a collection of loosely connected fiefdoms bound together by formal titles rather than effective governance. In the north, Swedish and later Prussian interests pressed in. In the east, Russia's influence grew steadily. From the south, Austria looked toward Polish territory as a means of securing its power in Central Europe. These neighbors did not need to invade aggressively. A web of bribes, alliances with factions inside the Commonwealth, and manipulation of the liberum veto ensured that Poland remained paralyzed. The dysfunction sometimes bordered on the absurd. One recorded incident tells of a noble using the liberum veto to cancel an entire session of parliament simply because he wanted to return home for dinner. While extreme, this story became a symbol of the system's flaws, highlighting how personal whims could halt governance for millions of people. Each obstruction represented another missed opportunity to fix the state's finances, rebuild its military, or modernize its administration. What followed was a steady erosion of independence. By the early 18th century, the Commonwealth no longer resembled the robust state of the Jagiellonian era. It existed more as a prize to be contested or protected depending on the needs of its neighbors. With each passing decade, Poland's internal liberties, once celebrated as a unique achievement, became the very mechanism that left it vulnerable to domination. In 1772, the political paralysis of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth reached a critical point. The weaknesses that had accumulated over the previous century could no longer be concealed by tradition or pride. Unable to enact serious reforms and divided by competing noble interests, the state represented an easy target for its more centralized and ambitious neighbors. Russia, Prussia, and Austria, each powerful in their own right, moved beyond rivalry to pursue a joint project, the division of Polish territory. This was unprecedented in European diplomacy. While wars, treaties, and conquests had often shifted borders, never before had several states coordinated to dismantle a sovereign country altogether while still maintaining the semblance of legality. To its neighbors, this was presented as a measure of stability. To Poland, it was the first step toward disappearance. The scale of the loss was staggering. Roughly 30% of the Commonwealth's land was handed over to the three powers. This was not empty frontier territory, but a region filled with towns, farmland, and millions of inhabitants. Around 30% of its population suddenly found themselves ruled from distant capitals rather than from Kraków or Warsaw. For Prussia, the seized lands included some of Poland's most fertile regions. For Austria, the acquisition solidified control over Galicia, a territory rich in natural resources. For Russia, it secured influence in the east, further tightening the grip it had already established in Polish affairs. The map of Central Europe changed overnight, and the balance of power shifted firmly in favor of Poland's neighbors. Inside Poland, the consequences were immediate. Loss of land meant loss of revenue from agriculture and trade routes, weakening the ability of the state to fund anything resembling a modern administration or armed forces. The kingdom that had been proud of its military traditions now found itself with limited capacity to defend its diminished borders. The problem was not just practical, but symbolic. The Commonwealth, once one of the largest states on the continent, now faced the reality of partial erasure. The reduction in size highlighted the danger that the entire structure might collapse if reforms were not implemented quickly. Yet, even in defeat, voices within the Commonwealth called for renewal. Intellectuals, scholars, and reform-minded nobles argued that modernization was still possible. They advocated centralization of authority, creation of a stronger army, and a more rational tax system. Printing presses circulated calls to strengthen the institutions weakened by centuries of misuse. These ideas reflected European currents of the Enlightenment, where reason and planning were promoted as tools to fix failing states. Hope lingered that with determination, the Commonwealth could still recover. But this optimism existed under the shadow of rising foreign influence, which ensured that too much reform would threaten the interests of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The reaction across Europe ranged from surprise to indifference. Smaller states recognized the danger the precedent set, that sovereignty could be undone not through war, but by coordinated agreement between stronger powers. But major monarchies, preoccupied with their own balance of power, accepted the arrangement. For them, a weakened Poland served as a buffer zone and as a tool for preserving stability. The loss of Polish independence mattered less than the prospect of avoiding direct conflict between great powers. Frederick the Great of Prussia, whose state gained valuable farmland during the division, boasted that he had added the most beautiful jewel in his crown. His words captured more than personal pride. They described a moment when Poland's weakness became someone else's triumph, and the First Partition set the stage for everything that followed. In the late 18th century, after years of political stagnation and foreign interference, Poland tried to restore its strength through reform. Intellectuals and statesmen gathered to write new laws, dreaming of a modern state that could compete with its powerful neighbors. Yet those neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, saw change as a direct threat. When Poland introduced the Constitution of 1791, the first of its kind in Europe, it was met not with applause, but with swift intervention. A conservative movement within the nobility, backed by outside forces, resisted reform, leading the country into turmoil. The result was brutal. In 1793, Russia and Prussia carved away huge territories in what became known as the Second Partition. This loss weakened an already fragile Commonwealth, shrinking both its borders and its ability to resist further aggression. The final blow came just 2 years later. After a failed national effort to resist encroachment, all three neighboring empires agreed to erase Poland once and for all. In 1795, the Third Partition stripped the country of its last remaining lands. Overnight, a nation that had once been among Europe's largest states disappeared from the map. Russia took the lion's share, absorbing eastern lands rich with farmland and towns. Prussia claimed regions that tied neatly into its growing state along the Vistula and in the west. Austria secured the southern territories, gaining fertile lands that boosted its influence. Each empire justified their actions as defending order, but in truth, it was an opportunistic seizure of a weakened state. For the last Polish king, Stanislaw August Poniatowski, the partition meant personal humiliation. Once a figure who tried to balance progressive reform and foreign pressures, he was stripped of authority and compelled to abdicate. Sent into exile, he lived quietly in St. Petersburg, far from the country he once led, until his death in 1798. His fate mirrored that of his kingdom: political defeat, dependency on foreign powers, and an ending without true closure. Yet even though the borders were erased, the nation itself did not vanish. Polish language and culture remained a unifying thread among the people left behind in the divided territories. Families continued to speak Polish in their homes. Schools secretly taught national history, and traditions carried on despite oversight by different foreign administrations. The sense of belonging to a shared past grew stronger precisely because the state no longer existed. This persistence laid the groundwork for an enduring national consciousness, one that could not be erased by decrees or boundary lines. Writers and thinkers stepped into the space left by lost sovereignty. Poems, political essays, and patriotic songs began to carry the dream of revival. The younger generation saw themselves not as citizens of Russia, Prussia, or Austria, but as guardians of a heritage waiting to be restored. Romantic ideals of freedom and sacrifice flourished, planting seeds for later uprisings that would try again and again to reclaim independence. A small tradition that captured this spirit appeared at private gatherings. Even under foreign rule, Poles would raise their glasses with the words, Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła, Poland is not yet lost. This simple toast, repeated quietly, spread from villages to cities, from exiles abroad to communities at home. It became the symbol of a promise, one that would echo into the 19th century and eventually open the lines of their national anthem. When Poland disappeared from the map in 1795, its people refused to treat the loss as permanent. The 19th century opened with Poles scattered across 3 different empires, forced to live under foreign rule, yet still tied by shared traditions and language. For many, the goal of independence became a mission passed down from generation to generation, despite the overwhelming power of their occupiers. Their response took many forms, but 2 of the most striking were armed insurrections and the flowering of a cultural movement that defined the century. The first large-scale revolt came in 1830, remembered as the November Uprising. It began in Warsaw, when young officers of the Polish army mutinied against their Russian commanders. News spread quickly, and within weeks, rebels seized control of the city, setting up a national government in defiance of the Tsar. Although enthusiasm was high, the uprising faced disunity. Some leaders hesitated to mobilize peasants, fearing that a radical war of liberation might undermine the social order. Meanwhile, Russia deployed vast forces to crush the rebellion. By 1831, after several battles marked by heavy losses, Russian troops stormed Warsaw, ending the hope that the uprising might succeed. Thousands of participants fled abroad, especially to France, forming what became known as the Great Emigration. The failure of 1830 did not end resistance. 30 years later, in 1863, Poles launched the January Uprising against Russia. Unlike the earlier revolt, this one grew from grassroots movements rather than from military mutiny. Its leaders relied on guerrilla tactics, fighting small battles in forests and rural areas rather than large set-piece wars. The insurrection dragged on for nearly 2 years, but the Russian Empire retaliated with harsh measures. Villages suspected of aiding rebels were burned, and mass deportations sent thousands to Siberia. Despite immense courage, the uprising collapsed, driving once again many survivors into exile. These repeated defeats did not extinguish the national spirit. Instead, they underscored how difficult it was to confront overwhelming imperial power directly. During the same century, culture became a powerful substitute for the lost state. Writers, poets, and composers transformed national trauma into lasting works of art. Adam Mickiewicz, widely seen as Poland's national bard, wrote epic poems that cast the nation's suffering as both heroic and sacred. Juliusz Słowacki, another towering figure, used theater and verse to explore themes of sacrifice and destiny. Their works spread far beyond Poland, giving voice to a stateless people across Europe. At the same time, Frédéric Chopin, living much of his life in Paris, expressed longing and nostalgia for his homeland through his piano pieces. His polonaises, infused with rhythms inspired by Polish dances, carried such strong patriotic associations that playing them under occupation was considered an act of defiance. Exile became not only the price of rebellion, but also the stage for keeping the dream alive. Polish émigrés organized societies in France, Britain, and Italy, aligning themselves with revolutionary causes in hopes that wider European upheavals might also bring an opportunity to restore Poland. They fought alongside foreign armies in conflicts ranging from the Napoleonic Wars to uprisings in Hungary and Italy, earning Poland the symbolic name Christ of Nations, a country seen as sacrificing itself for the freedom of others. Though their homeland remained partitioned, their contributions abroad kept their cause visible, reinforcing the notion that Poland's destiny was tied to the broader struggle for liberty across Europe. Together, armed uprisings and cultural achievements formed a dual resistance. One was waged with weapons, short-lived though desperate. The other lived in poems, music, and ideals that reached audiences far beyond Polish borders. This blend of defiance ensured that the idea of Poland never truly disappeared, even in the absence of a state. By the century's end, the dream of independence was still alive, carried forward by both memory and art. After the crushing defeats of the 19th century uprisings, Poland did not regain its independence. Instead, its territory remained divided among three empires: Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Each took a different approach, but all shared the goal of weakening Polish identity and preventing the emergence of nationalist movements. Everyday life for the people who once belonged to the Commonwealth now depended on which partition they lived in, with distinct pressures and limits shaped by the occupying power. In the Russian-controlled lands, policies of Russification targeted every layer of society. The Polish language was excluded from schools and replaced with Russian as the official medium of instruction. Catholic institutions lost their independence as the state placed restrictions on clergy and closed monasteries that were seen as politically active. Even the visual presence of Polish culture was limited, as Russian authorities promoted Orthodox traditions and replaced local symbols with imperial ones. Over time, these measures forced Poles into private spaces to maintain their customs, strengthening the role of family and informal education as guardians of national identity. Prussian Poland faced another type of assimilation program. Authorities pursued Germanization, which shaped not only schools, but also access to land and economic power. Local Polish newspapers were suppressed, and publishing in Polish became increasingly difficult. Land reforms and legal restrictions favored German settlers while pushing many Polish landowners and farmers into disadvantageous positions. The state invested in colonization programs, moving German populations into Polish areas to weaken the ties of community. At the same time, Polish children were required to learn in German, and the use of their native language at school could even lead to punishment. These policies created long-term resentment, but also motivated communities to defend their culture by supporting underground institutions. The Austrian-ruled territories presented a notable contrast. Galicia, though poor and underdeveloped, allowed relatively more autonomy than the Russian or Prussian zones. Here, Polish elites gained positions in local administration, and universities in Kraków and Lvov became centers where Polish thought and scholarship could survive. Intellectual life grew despite economic hardship, with writers, historians, and educators gathering in these cities to sustain national traditions. Though Austria still held ultimate authority, the atmosphere was less oppressive, making Galicia a hub where Polish culture could continue to develop openly when it was suppressed elsewhere. Across all three partitions, Poles refused to abandon the notion of a shared community. Instead of relying on open rebellion, which had ended in defeat, they turned to the concept of a nation in spirit. This meant maintaining loyalty through culture, literature, religion, and education, even when political independence seemed impossible. Families organized secret lessons to teach history and language. Cultural societies sprang up in towns and villages, and artists contributed works that reminded people of their heritage. These quiet acts of resistance gave people a sense of continuity through generations and kept alive the vision of eventual recovery. A particularly creative response came from Poles under Prussian rule. Since military uprisings had failed, they launched what became known as the Organic Work Movement. This approach emphasized strengthening the nation from within by building schools, advancing industry, and promoting modern farming techniques. Instead of fighting on battlefields, they fought by excelling in trade, business, and education, creating lasting institutions that could survive foreign rule. Even under hostile occupation, these strategies enabled communities to adapt while preparing silently for a future when independence could again be imagined. When war erupted in 1914, the people of Poland saw in it a possibility that had been denied for generations. Their country had been missing from the map for over a century, absorbed into empires that were now turning on one another. For ordinary Polish families, this meant uncertainty and danger, but also the chance that the collapse of old powers could create space for rebirth. As armies clashed across Europe, Poles carried divided loyalties not by choice, but by circumstance, since the partitioning states conscripted them into their forces. In the East, Polish men were pulled into the Russian army. In the West, others were drafted into the German forces. And in the South, still more were ordered to fight for Austria-Hungary. In effect, millions of Poles went to war fighting on opposing sides, sometimes even facing each other across the battlefield. The physical land of Poland quickly became one of the bloodiest contested zones of the war. Battles swept across villages and countrysides, destroying homes and driving families to flee. Entire communities were uprooted as front lines shifted back and forth with each campaign. The situation was chaotic, but to many Polish patriots, it represented the one opportunity they had waited for. If the war bankrupted the empires that had divided the country in 1795, perhaps the defeat of at least one of them could open the door to an independent Poland. Leaders began to organize, each trying to position the Polish cause in alignment with whichever power seemed most likely to support independence once the fighting ended. Among these leaders, Józef Piłsudski became one of the most influential figures. A lifelong nationalist who had once opposed Russian dominance, he decided to work with Austria-Hungary at the outbreak of the war. His reasoning was practical. If Poles fought under Austrian command, they might later demand concessions and recognition. He organized the Polish Legions, a military formation that drilled under Austrian auspices but owed its true allegiance to the idea of a free Poland. Piłsudski walked a careful line, using the resources of Austria-Hungary to train and arm his men, while openly declaring that he was preparing them for the day Poland would be independent again. His gamble set him apart, as other Polish activists placed their hopes in Russia or later in the Western Allies. Divisions among leaders reflected the uncertainty of the time. Roman Dmowski, another influential figure, took a different path. He believed that supporting Russia and later seeking the favor of Britain and France held the best possibility for international recognition of a future Polish state. This rivalry between approaches did not always produce unity, but it demonstrated the determination of Poles to prepare for every possible outcome. Whether aligned with Austria, Russia, or the Entente powers, all shared the same underlying aim, that when the war was over, Poland would return. By 1917 and 1918, the tides of war brought changes that favored this cause. The Russian Revolution destabilized one partitioning empire entirely, pulling it away from Central Europe. At the same time, the Central Powers faced collapse as their armies weakened. When Germany and Austria-Hungary lost the war in November 1918, a political opening appeared. On November 11th, Piłsudski returned to Warsaw from captivity. He assumed command and began the task of reconstructing state institutions. That very day, the general armistice ending the war in Europe was signed. For Poles, it marked not only the end of global conflict, but also the rebirth of their country. Today, November 11th remains their National Independence Day, commemorating the moment Poland's long exile as a nation without sovereignty finally ended. After more than a century of partitions, Poland returned to the map in 1918 as the Second Polish Republic. The announcement of independence was filled with hope, but it came with vast challenges. The state had to be built from scratch, since for the previous 123 years, no central government had existed. Infrastructure lay in ruins after the First World War, cities bore the marks of occupation, and the economy suffered from shortages of food, coal, and transport. Even basics like currency were uncertain. In some parts, people used German marks, while in others they paid in Russian or Austrian crowns. Establishing a single system was one of the first steps toward unifying the country. Unification was more complex than restoring state institutions. The old Commonwealth had once stretched across regions that by 1918 lived under 3 different empires. Each had left its mark, creating differences in law, administration, even in gauges of railway tracks. In Russian lands, the Cyrillic alphabet was familiar, while Prussian-ruled areas had adopted German-style schooling and legal codes. Austria had allowed more autonomy, producing a different political climate. All of these fragments had to be joined into one republic, and this process shaped the first years after independence. Broader defense was another urgent concern. The state faced disputes along nearly all of its frontiers as neighbors pressed their own territorial ambitions. The most decisive conflict came against Soviet Russia. Between 1919 and 1921, Polish forces fought a large-scale war to push back the Red Army. At first, the struggle seemed precarious, with Soviet troops advancing toward Warsaw. Yet in August 1920, Polish forces launched a bold counteroffensive. The outcome, later called the Miracle on the Vistula, forced the Soviets into retreat and secured Poland's independence. The subsequent Treaty of Riga in 1921 fixed borders that remained until the next World War. With external threats temporarily contained, focus turned inward. Political life in the Second Republic was loud and combative. New parties and movements vied for influence, ranging from traditional conservatives and religious activists to socialists and farmers' groups. The parliamentary system allowed for active debate, but coalition governments proved unstable, and cabinets often shifted in rapid succession. Frustrated with this instability, Józef Piłsudski, who had stepped aside after independence, returned to power in 1926 by force. His coup placed him at the center of politics until his death, shaping the republic into what historians describe as semi-authoritarian rule. Elections continued, but authority rested heavily in Piłsudski's hands and in the loyal officers who supported him. Despite turbulence, social and cultural life expanded. Cities like Warsaw, Kraków, and Lvov modernized with electric trams, theaters, and cinemas contributing to an urban atmosphere similar to other European capitals. Interwar Poland became known for its writers, painters, and filmmakers who experimented with modern art and literature. Radio broadcasting linked distant communities across the republic, spreading news and entertainment. Universities trained a new generation of scholars who contributed both to national identity and to European academic life. The Republic was not only Polish in character. By the 1930s, Warsaw had become home to one of the largest Jewish populations in the world, second only to New York City. Jewish cultural societies, theaters, and newspapers flourished, adding to the vibrant mix of traditions present in the state. Alongside Ukrainians, Belarusians, Germans, and other minorities, Poland in the interwar years was a patchwork society that reflected its diverse past while pushing toward a modern future. At dawn on September 1, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland, setting in motion the conflict that would become the Second World War. Columns of tanks surged across the countryside, aircraft bombed towns and railroads, and naval forces struck along the coast. For the civilian population, the invasion was sudden and destructive, with communication systems quickly disrupted and much of the army caught unprepared by the scale of the assault. For German leaders, the plan relied on overwhelming speed to crush resistance before allies could respond. Within days, battles erupted from the Baltic shore to the plains near Warsaw, and the Polish army faced pressure on multiple fronts. Despite the imbalance in strength, Polish soldiers resisted with determination. At Westerplatte, a small garrison held out for 7 days against repeated German attacks, becoming an early symbol of defiance. Elsewhere, cavalry units maneuvered against mechanized German forces. The charge at Krojanty became legendary, not because horses fought tanks, but because mounted troops struck at infantry, stalling German advances long enough for Polish units to regroup. These stories underscored the commitment of men and women who fought even when the odds were impossible. Their actions delayed advances, disrupted timetables, and showed that the invasion would not go uncontested. 2 weeks later, on September 17th, the situation grew even darker. From the east, the Soviet Union invaded, citing its own security interests, but in truth, acting on the terms of a secret agreement with Germany. This second invasion sealed Poland's defeat. Already stretched thin, Polish forces could not fight both great powers at once. Resistance broke down, and the government made the painful decision to evacuate. First south into Romania, and then later to France and Britain. In exile, leaders established institutions that continued to represent the Polish state, coordinating military units abroad and maintaining diplomatic ties to the Allies. Inside the occupied country, the population endured a harsh reality. German and Soviet authorities both sought to suppress Polish identity and remove potential opposition. Executions of intellectuals, clergy, and officers attempted to break the national spirit. Forced labor sent thousands into German industry, while deportations from Soviet-controlled zones carried entire families eastward into Siberia. Cultural life faced strict censorship, schools were closed or reduced to basic skills, and higher education was banned in many areas. Despite these measures, underground networks formed. Secret classrooms kept language and history alive, while resistance movements organized sabotage, intelligence gathering, and eventually, armed struggle. The occupation produced some of the most brutal policies of the war. Whole villages were destroyed if suspected of aiding fighters. Urban populations faced constant fear of mass arrests. Yet, against this backdrop, Polish resistance persisted. The government in exile helped coordinate one of the largest underground states in Europe, complete with clandestine courts, newspapers, and even theatrical performances. Fighters in the Home Army prepared for uprisings and supplied intelligence to the Allies, proving that although Poland had no longer existed as a state, its institutions survived through hidden efforts. One contribution often overlooked occurred even before the war began. Polish cryptologists had been studying German communications and succeeded in breaking key elements of the Enigma machine, the cipher system relied upon by the German military. In 1939, they shared their findings with British and French allies. This knowledge became crucial to later Allied code-breaking during the war, shaping the outcome of intelligence efforts on multiple fronts. It was a reminder that Poland's role in the global conflict began not only with resistance on the battlefield, but also with intellectual breakthroughs that proved decisive in the wider struggle. When Germany occupied Poland in 1939, it became the center of the Nazi plan to exterminate entire populations. The country's location, large Jewish communities, and rail networks made it the site for some of the deadliest facilities in human history. Camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor were not simple prisons, but institutions designed specifically for mass killing. Trains carried millions from across Europe into these places, where many were murdered within hours of arrival. Jews were the primary target, but Polish citizens, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and others who were seen as enemies of the regime were also killed. The sheer scale of death carried out on Polish soil marked it as the epicenter of the Holocaust. For those who were not immediately sent to camps, life under occupation was marked by constant fear. Ghettos in cities such as Warsaw, Lodz, and Kraków confined hundreds of thousands of people into small, walled districts where hunger and disease spread rapidly. Families lived in cramped rooms, children scavenged for food, and survival often depended on smuggling goods past guards. Conditions were meant to wear communities down slowly before deportations to camps completed the process. These ghettos became symbols of both despair and resilience, showing how communities tried to preserve dignity in the face of deliberate destruction. Despite overwhelming danger, resistance existed. Poles built one of the largest underground movements in Europe, combining political activists, former soldiers, and everyday citizens. Known as the Home Army, or Armia Krajowa, this network organized sabotage of rail lines, created illegal newspapers, and coordinated intelligence passed on to the Allies. Even acts as small as secretly teaching the Polish language carried severe penalties if discovered. Students met in apartments with volunteer teachers to study mathematics, history, and literature at what became known as the Secret University. Operating in basements and living rooms, it was both an educational institution and a form of cultural defiance. Jewish residents also resisted within the ghettos. The clearest example came in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. When Germans moved to deport the remaining population, fighters launched an armed uprising using smuggled and homemade weapons. For nearly a month, they fought against far larger and better armed German units. Buildings were burned, barricades raised, and daily battles waged until overwhelming firepower ended the revolt. Though the fighters were defeated, the event became the largest Jewish armed resistance action of the war, and a lasting symbol of defiance. Another major attempt at resistance occurred the following year. In August 1944, the Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising, aiming to liberate the capital before advancing Soviet forces entered the city. For 63 days, street battles raged as Polish fighters tried to hold out with limited supplies. They captured districts, printed newspapers, and maintained hope that help would arrive. But the support never came. German reinforcements crushed the uprising, systematically demolishing large portions of the city afterward. Tens of thousands were killed, and the destruction left Warsaw nearly in ruins. The cost of resistance was staggering, yet it showed the determination of occupied Poland to survive as more than a conquered territory. Cultural life, secret schools, underground presses, and armed struggle all demonstrated that the identity of the nation could not be erased, even amidst the most deliberate campaign of annihilation in modern history. When the war ended in 1945, Poland did not regain full independence. Instead, it was drawn into the orbit of the Soviet Union, which shaped its politics, its economy, and its borders. 2 years later, in 1947, the country was formally declared the Polish People's Republic. This made Poland a satellite state, one of several nations in Eastern Europe governed under communist systems that operated closely with Moscow. It was a sharp shift from the Interwar Republic to a regime that restricted freedoms and reorganized everyday life under one-party authority. The boundaries of the nation were also redrawn. Poland's eastern territories, including areas with cities like Lvov and Vilnius, were absorbed into the Soviet Union. To balance this loss, the country gained control of former German lands in the west and north. Cities such as Gdansk, Wrocław, and Szczecin became Polish again, though their German heritage was still visible in architecture and urban design. Millions of people were displaced in the process. Germans who had lived for generations in those areas were forced to leave, while Poles from eastern lands now belonged to the Soviet Union and had to move into the new territories. This reshuffling of populations left scars, but also reshaped Poland into roughly the borders we recognize today. Inside the country, the communist government sought to control both public life and private thought. A centrally planned economy replaced free markets, prioritizing heavy industry and collectivized farming. Propaganda promoted the image of progress, but shortages of consumer goods revealed the limits of the system. Political opposition was suppressed by the secret police, who monitored citizens, censored press and art, and jailed or silenced dissidents. Elections became ceremonies without real choice, since the ruling party ensured its monopoly on power. Resistance never fully disappeared, but it had to remain underground to avoid harsh reprisals. The tight grip of the state did not prevent unrest. In June 1956, workers in the city of Poznan went on strike, protesting poor economic conditions and political repression. The demonstrations quickly escalated and were met with violent response from security forces, leaving dozens dead. This uprising became the first in a series of challenges to communist rule. Later decades brought more unrest, especially in the 1970s, when shortages worsened and strikes erupted in shipyards and factories. Each protest tested the strength of the government and revealed that discontent reached far beyond small groups of activists. Life under communism had its daily routines, where many citizens navigated shortages with resourcefulness. Queues for food, clothing, and fuel became common features of city streets. Families relied on ration cards, and basic goods like meat or sugar were often limited. Yet alongside this, cultural life found hidden channels. Independent writers, underground printing presses, and Catholic traditions provided outlets where people could express ideas outside of state control. Religion played a particularly strong role, offering a space where individuals could gather without direct interference from officials, despite official atheist policies. A turning point in morale came in 1978. Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, the Archbishop of Kraków, was elected as Pope, taking the name John Paul II. He was the first non-Italian to hold the position in over 4 centuries. For Poles, his elevation carried deep symbolic meaning. Visits he made to his homeland drew millions, inspiring many to believe that spiritual solidarity could also lead to political solidarity. His presence emboldened opposition, helping prepare the ground for the organized movements that would emerge in the 1980s. In the summer of 1980, workers at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk walked off their jobs. Their immediate demands were better wages and safer conditions, but soon those demands expanded into something unprecedented in the communist bloc. Led by an electrician named Lech Wałęsa, the strikers organized themselves into a new labor union, one that refused government control. They called it Solidarity, or Solidarność in Polish, and it quickly attracted attention not just from fellow workers, but from students, intellectuals, and clergy. Within months, millions had joined, making it the largest social movement in Eastern Europe outside the Communist Party apparatus. The scale of solidarity gave it influence far beyond any single workplace. Meetings of the Union became political gatherings in which ordinary citizens voiced frustrations about shortages, censorship, and the lack of free expression. Support from the Catholic Church provided protection and a moral dimension that attracted even more members. Priests hosted meetings, encouraged participation, and framed the Union's goals as part of a broader struggle for human dignity. Solidarity was not simply a trade union. It became a platform for society to express its desire for reform after decades of repression. The regime reacted with fear. In December 1981, the government declared martial law across Poland. Tanks rolled into cities, curfews were imposed, and the army patrolled streets. Leaders of Solidarity, including Wałęsa, were jailed or placed under surveillance. Independent publications were banned, phone lines were restricted, and military tribunals tried civilians. The hope was that the crackdown would silence dissent once and for all. But rather than eliminating the movement, it drove it underground. Hidden printing presses produced leaflets and newspapers, and secret meetings continued across factories, schools, and churches, keeping the network alive despite constant monitoring. Throughout the 1980s, the Polish People's Republic faced severe economic decline. Shortages of food and daily commodities intensified, queues outside shops stretched longer than ever, and inflation eroded wages. Discontent spread well beyond activists, touching nearly every household. When combined with the persistence of solidarity in the underground, the government found itself unable to secure loyalty from the population. Strikes repeatedly resurfaced, even under the threat of police action, showing that martial law had created compliance on paper, but not in reality. By the second half of the decade, international circumstances also played a role. The Soviet Union itself faced change as policies of openness and reform emerged under Mikhail Gorbachev. This reduced the likelihood of a violent Soviet intervention in Poland, something the authorities had long used as justification for crackdowns. With less external backing and more pressure at home, the Polish leadership finally moved to negotiate with the opposition rather than simply suppress it. In 1989, the roundtable talks took place between communist officials and representatives of Solidarity. These meetings set the conditions for semi-free elections, the first of their kind in the region since the war. When ballots were cast, Solidarity achieved a sweeping victory, winning nearly every seat it was allowed to contest. This outcome effectively ended communist dominance in Poland and signaled a wider shift across Eastern Europe. Solidarity's red-letter logo, drawn like a marching crowd carrying a flag, became a recognizable sign far beyond Poland. It appeared on posters, walls, and banners as far away as Berlin and Buenos Aires, turning the Polish trade union into a global emblem of resistance and freedom. When communism ended in 1989, Poland faced challenges that touched every aspect of daily life. Political leaders had to transform a one-party system into a democracy, while economists designed a market economy in a society that had relied on state planning for 4 decades. Factories that once operated under government quotas now had to compete in open markets. Prices, once fixed, began to reflect supply and demand. For ordinary citizens, this meant sudden hardships as inflation rose and formally subsidized services became more expensive. Jobs in outdated industries disappeared, but new opportunities gradually emerged. The transition was uneven, leaving some communities struggling while others quickly adapted to the changing system. The 1990s soon became a period of political experimentation. Multiple parties formed, coalitions came and went, and debates arose over how to balance reform with social stability. Institutions of democracy, including free media, courts, and parliamentary elections, functioned with a level of freedom unseen since the interwar years. Civil society expanded, with organizations, associations, and student groups shaping discourse about the future. These developments gave citizens more input, but also revealed divisions over how fast or slow transformation should proceed. The memory of communist rule made cautious reform attractive to some, but younger generations often demanded quicker modernization and closer links to the West. Poland's security position changed as well. In 1999, the country officially joined NATO. For Poles, this meant aligning with an alliance that guaranteed military support from Western powers, a protection that felt vital given their 20th century experiences of occupation. Membership required modernization of the armed forces, training under new doctrines, and integration into joint exercises that connected Poland to its European and North American allies. The move reflected a broader orientation toward the West, setting the stage for deeper political and economic engagement with Europe. The next major step came in 2004, when Poland entered the European Union. Integration with the EU reshaped both the economy and everyday life. Access to European markets boosted exports and foreign investment. Infrastructure projects funded by EU resources transformed roads, bridges, and urban centers. Mobility increased as young Poles traveled to study or work in other member states, sending remittances back home and linking Poland more closely with the rest of the continent. Farmers benefited from subsidies, while universities joined research networks across Europe. At the same time, membership also sparked debates about how to balance sovereignty with integration. Some welcomed shared rules as modernization, while others feared the erosion of national traditions. Economically, Poland experienced notable growth during the early 21st century. Shifts in industry, the expansion of services, and foreign companies setting up operations contributed to the rapid development. Cities like Warsaw, Kraków, and Wrocław modernized quickly, becoming centers of finance, technology, and education. The economy was one of the few in Europe to avoid recession during the 2008 financial crisis, reinforcing the perception of stability and potential. Rising living standards, new consumer markets, and growing international visibility all marked Poland's transformation from a struggling post-communist state into a middle power with influence in European affairs. Yet modernization has not ended political debates. Arguments over democratic reforms, the role of the judiciary, relations with the EU, and questions of national identity continue to shape public life. The memory of lost sovereignty still informs how leaders and citizens view outside pressure. Poland balances its role as an EU member with a strong sense of independence, a dynamic common across its history. Poland's story shows that nations can rise, fall, and rise again, but culture and spirit endure. If you want more history like this, don't forget to subscribe.